There is something about the American working man in America in the 1970s that captures a moment we will never see again. The lunch pail in hand, the union card in the wallet, the belief that hard work meant a house, a car, and a future for the kids. If someone punched a clock back then, they know exactly what that decade felt like. This was a time when a single income could support a family. Factories were booming, and American manufacturing meant something. A man could graduate high school on Friday and start a job with benefits on Monday. The work was hard, but the reward was real. This was the decade that gave us overtime pay that actually meant something. Company picnics, pension plans, and the last true era of the American middle class. The counterculture was fading, but the working class remained the backbone of the nation. But something was shifting beneath the surface. By the end of this decade, factories would start closing. Jobs would start disappearing. The American dream would begin slipping away from the very people who built it. What happened in those final years changed everything. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like for the working man in America in the 1970s. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why that era feels so distant now. Let's step into that world. The working man in 1970s America woke up early. The alarm clock was analog, loud, and it sat on the nightstand. There was no snooze button culture. When the alarm rang at 5 or 6 in the morning, men got up. There was a shift to make, and being late meant trouble. Breakfast was hearty. Eggs, bacon, toast, maybe some oatmeal. Coffee percolated on the stove or in one of those electric percolators that sat on the counter. Wives often woke up to make breakfast before their husbands left. This was the era before drive-through coffee and breakfast sandwiches. A man ate at his own kitchen table. The commute to work was different than today. Many working men lived close to where they worked. Factory towns were built around the factories. Steel towns, auto towns, mill towns. A man might walk to work or drive just a few miles. The highways were not yet clogged with suburban commuters. Traffic existed, but it was manageable. The car in the driveway was American-made: Ford, Chevy, Dodge. These were big sedans or pickup trucks built in the same factories where neighbors worked. Buying American was not a slogan. It was just what people did. Japanese imports were starting to appear, but they were still a curiosity, not yet a threat. The factory floor in the 1970s was loud, hot, and physical. Men worked with their hands. Assembly lines moved at a relentless pace. Steel mills glowed orange from molten metal. Auto plants echoed with the sound of machinery. These were not comfortable jobs. They were hard jobs, but they paid. A factory job in the early 1970s could pay enough to buy a house, support a wife and children, own 2 cars, and take a vacation once a year. This was not wealth. This was middle class, and it was achievable with a high school diploma and a willingness to work. The union was central to working life. Union membership peaked in the 1970s. The AFL-CIO, the UAW, and the steelworkers negotiated contracts that guaranteed wages, benefits, and protections. The union hall was a gathering place. Union meetings were where workers had a voice. Having a union job meant having power. It meant the company could not fire workers on a whim. It meant overtime was paid at time and a half. It meant health insurance covered the family. It meant a pension waited at the end. These were not guarantees that previous generations had enjoyed. They were won through decades of struggle. Before we continue with the challenges and changes that transform the working man's world, if you are enjoying this look back at how Americans really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. The lunch break was sacred. Men carried lunch pails or metal lunch boxes. Inside was a sandwich made at home, maybe some fruit, a thermos of coffee or soup. Some plants had cafeterias where workers could buy hot food. But many men ate what their wives packed, sitting on benches or in break rooms, talking with coworkers about sports, family, and politics. The workday was 8 hours, but overtime was common. There were double shifts during busy seasons and weekend work when orders needed filling. Men took the overtime because the money was good and because that was what you did. Providing for the family meant working when work was available. After the shift ended, the working man came home tired, really tired. Physical labor took a toll on bodies. Backs ached. Hands were calloused. The shower after work was essential, washing off the grime and sweat of the day. Then dinner with the family, gathered around the table, talking about school and neighborhood news. Evening entertainment was simple. Television dominated. All in the Family premiered in 1971 and became the most watched show in America. Archie Bunker was a working man, and millions of working men saw themselves in him. The struggles with a changing world, the arguments at the dinner table, the frustrations and the love. Sports were religion. Monday Night Football began in 1970 and changed how America watched the game. Baseball remained the national pastime. Men followed their local teams with devotion. The bar after work, or on weekends, was where sports were discussed and debated. Bowling leagues were massive. Thursday night bowling was a fixture of working-class social life. Teams from different factories or unions would compete. The bowling alley was smoky, loud, and full of camaraderie. Trophies were displayed proudly at home. The neighborhood bar was an extension of the living room. It was a place where men gathered after work for a beer or two. They knew the bartender by name, and the bartender knew them. These were not fancy places. They were corner bars with neon signs, wooden stools, and a television showing the game. Weekends had their own rhythm. Saturday morning meant chores, mowing the lawn, fixing things around the house, washing the car. Working men were handy. They had to be. Calling a repairman cost money, so they learned to fix what broke. Garages were workshops. Tools were collected and maintained. Sunday was for church and family. Most working-class families attended services, Catholic, Protestant, whatever tradition the family followed. After church came Sunday dinner, often a larger meal with extended family gathering. These weekly rituals structured life and reinforced community bonds. The economic pressures of the 1970s hit working families hard. The oil crisis of 1973 sent gasoline prices soaring. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. For a man who drove to work, this was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. The cost of commuting suddenly mattered. Inflation was relentless throughout the decade. The cost of everything kept rising. Groceries, utilities, clothing for the kids. Wages rose too, but never quite fast enough. The squeeze was constant. Families that had felt comfortable at the start of the decade felt stressed by the end. And then the factories started to change. Foreign competition was intensifying. Steel from Japan was cheaper. Cars from Germany and Japan were gaining market share. The industries that had employed generations of American workers were under pressure. The layoffs began. First a few, then more. Plants that had operated for decades announced closures. Towns that had been built around single industries watched their futures disappear. Men who had expected to work until retirement found themselves unemployed in their 40s or 50s. Youngstown, Ohio, lost its steel mills. Flint, Michigan watched auto plants close. Across the industrial heartland, the story repeated. The secure jobs that had defined working-class life were vanishing. The union contracts that had protected workers could not protect against plants shutting down entirely. For those who kept their jobs, the anxiety grew. Every rumor of layoffs sent fear through the workforce. The confidence of the early 1970s gave way to uncertainty. The belief that hard work guaranteed a good life was being tested. The working man's relationship with his children was changing too. Sons who might have followed their fathers into the factory were being told to go to college instead. The path that had worked for generations was no longer reliable. Education became the new ticket to the middle class, even as factory jobs had provided that ticket before. Daughters were increasingly working outside the home. The women's movement was changing expectations. Families that had survived on one income now needed two. This was presented as progress, and in many ways it was. But it also meant the old model of the working man as sole provider was ending. What defined the working man in 1970s America was a particular moment in history. The unions were strong. The factories were running. The middle class was broad and accessible to those without college degrees. A man could work hard and see that work translate directly into a better life for his family. The decade saw the peak of this system and the beginning of its decline. The oil shocks, the inflation, the foreign competition, the forces that would transform American industry were already in motion. But for those who lived it, there were still good years to be had. For those who punched the clock in 1970s America, it was a time of hard work and real reward, of union solidarity and company loyalty, of lunch pails and bowling leagues and Sunday dinners. It was the last decade when the American working man could believe, with some justification, that the system worked for him. The factories of that era are mostly gone now. The union halls have emptied. The bars where men gathered after work have closed. But the memories of that world remain. And for those with memories of this remarkable era in American working life, there is always more history to explore.